Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about the Aryan homeland debate, a debate that at the moment arouses a lot of passions among the scholarly community in Europe and among a much larger audience in India, where this debate still has political consequences. Aryan is an obsolete term for Indo-European. It was used in the 19th and early 20th centuries, borrowed of course from Sanskrit. The scholars noticed that in the Rig Veda, the seers refer to themselves as Arya. They also see in Iranian texts that the Iranians equally refer to themselves as Arya. So they deduced that all Indo-Europeans refer to themselves as Arya. This has been indeed attested for Anatolia, Iranian and Vedic Sanskrit. And so they thought that Aryan was something like a name for Indo-European, a name by which the Indo-European tribes designated themselves. So they brought in the word Aryan at the same time when terms like Indo-Germanic or Indo-European were also launched, namely in the 1820s. So the Indo-European language family is a name for a grouping of most Indian and most European languages that are deemed to be descendants of a same ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European and spoken about 6,000 years ago, that is about 4000 BC. At any time in known history, including today, you can observe the process of disintegration of unified languages into different dialects, which can go their own way and become languages in their own right. For instance, in the early centuries AD, you see how vulgar Latin, the colloquial form of Latin, disintegrates into languages that ultimately become Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, Italian, and Romanian. So this process took place earlier as well. And so if we draw the arrow in the opposite direction into the past, what has been a disintegration of languages becomes an integration, an ultimate convergence on a common ancestor. Now, for some languages, this is a very distant thing. This commonality goes back to the origin of language, coinciding more or less with the origin of mankind, tens of thousands of years ago. Time enough for these languages to grow totally unrecognizably apart. But for other languages, it turns out that they have a fairly recent common ancestor and that they still resemble one another to a fair extent. And so that is the case with the Indo-European languages, most languages of Europe, most languages of northern India, as well as Sri Lanka. This reconstruction of an original common ancestor is not entirely up in the air. It is fairly grounded. This language was still fairly close to its oldest daughters, which are Vedic Sanskrit, Hittite, and Mycenaean Greek, which latter languages were spoken about 1500 BC. So that's still fairly close, 2500 to 3000 years after Proto-Indo-European. The method we use to reconstruct this ancestor is the comparative historical method. Hindus often argue that anything that Westerners have to offer is so recent and is just fanciful compared to the solid linguistics developed by Panini. And Panini himself already was only a compiler, an analyst of earlier theories of linguistics. And he himself, Panini, is dated to probably 500 BC. Now, he was a great linguist, no doubt, and modern linguistics owes everything to the discovery of Panini's work. Nevertheless, Panini only worked on the Indo-Aryan languages, the languages of India, mainly of Sanskrit, also the relation between Sanskrit and the colloquial, the vernacular languages that were closely related to it. Even though he lived in the very northwest of India, very close to the Iranian language area, and also very close to the non-Indo-European Burushaski language area. He never spoke of those languages, though he must have known them. He only speaks of Sanskrit and then the colloquial forms of Sanskrit. So, in that sense, he did not know of those methods that make this rediscovery of Proto-Indo-European possible. He did not have the comparative method, comparing very different languages, nor the historical method. He did not compare different stages of the development of one language. So the related words in modern languages allow us to reconstruct the common ancestral term common to both or to all of them. This unattested form is marked by an asterisk, a little star before or after the word. So that means that, if you see that little star, it means that the word that follows is not attested, it is only reconstructed. And so some skeptics in India say, oh, it's only a ghost language. You see, nobody is known to have spoken this language. There are no texts in this language. And that is true. It's perfectly true. Nevertheless, we can know quite a bit about this ancestral language. The reconstructions made by scholars are not so fanciful. You see, many times they have been corroborated by new discoveries. For example, the Romance languages, Spanish, Catalan, Italian, and so on, they go back to a common ancestor, which, however, is not literary Latin, the kind of classical Latin that we still have learned in school. It goes back to a vulgar, a colloquial Latin. And that is not attested, that was not written down. And it is somewhat different from the Latin that was written down. Well, it so happens that this ghost language, vulgar Latin, that it has been discovered as attested in the graffiti found in the buried city of Pompeii. Pompeii was the victim of an outburst of a volcano, and so it was well preserved, and when it was dug up, many graffiti were found in vulgar Latin, and so they confirmed the suspicions of the linguists that vulgar Latin must look somewhat in such a way that it could be the ancestor of Italian, Spanish, and so on. Or, for example, a 19th century linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure thought that Proto-Indo-European must have contained sounds which were similar to what exists in Semitic, namely throat sounds, which you find in Arabic. For instance, you have not Muhammad, but Muhammad, this ha sound. Or you have, for instance, not Ali, but Ali. So you have these throat sounds, well attested in Semitic. De Saussure thought that they also had existed in Proto-Indo-European. Now, this was purely hypothetical. there was no proof of it at all. There were only traces of it. Namely, in most Indo-European languages, these sounds have simply disappeared. In Greek, they have left a trace in the form of a vowel. For example, you have the word nr, nar, which means man, like in Sanskrit, nr, nara means man. Now, the related Greek word starts with a vowel aner. Aner means man. So this way, there was already a suspicion that such sounds must have existed and then later developed either into just nothing, just disappeared, or into vowels. Now, when Hittite was discovered about 1 century ago, in around 1915, when Hittite was discovered, a language spoken in Anatolia, it turned out that Hittite did have these sounds that had been postulated hypothetically. They turned out to be real and still existing. Well, still existing. Hittite has died out 3,000 years ago, but at least then still existing in Hittite. So very often there are corroborations from reality, from empirical evidence of what had first been developed as a hypothesis. So this Proto-Indo-European language, though of course we can't know it perfectly, nevertheless has been verified here and there, and it turns out that in their work of reconstruction, the scholars have not done poorly at all. Sometimes also they are corrected in their hypotheses by new discoveries. For example, there is a division in the Indo-European languages between the Kentum and the Satem languages. Let me explain. There is a word for 100 which must have sounded in Proto-European something like kntn. So in Latin this becomes cantum, a word that we still have in English, for instance, in the word cent or century or percentage. But originally it was pronounced kentum, right? In Greek this is hekaton. The he means one, so we get 100. But so the word 100 itself is katon. Now in Sanskrit this becomes shata, and in Iranian it becomes satem. Then scholars thought, well, this Sanskritic Iranian form is typical for the Eastern languages, also existing in Albanian, in Slavic, in Baltic, whereas the Kentum forms are typical for the Western languages, existing in Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic. But then there was a discovery, namely of Tocharian, the Tocharian language spoken in Xinjiang, and extinct since about 1200 years. But so it did exist, it has a rich literature, and there we find that surprisingly it has the Kentum forms, which are typical or had been deemed typical of the Western, of the European languages. Recently, in the 1990s, one more such language has been discovered in India, in the foothills of the Himalaya. There used to be a language, Proto-Bangani, which has left a number of loan words into modern Bangani, which is a dialect of Hindi. And that too turned out to be typical Kentu. For example, it has the word dokru, which means deer. If it had been a Satem language like Sanskrit, this would have been dashru, but it is not. It still has the original Kentum form. So surprisingly, we find that these Kentum languages were spoken not only in the far west of the Indo-European expanse, but also in the east. Okay, so we leave it at that for the procedure of reconstruction. We conclude that this reconstruction is a fairly good approximation of what the reality must have been. You see, history is reconstructing things as they have really been. So we are not satisfied for a postmodern vagueness that anything goes, that anyone is free to think anything. Okay, anyone is free to think anything, but it needn't be true. Now we aim for the truth, and we realize that we will not be able to get at it perfectly, but we can, what is called asymptotically, make an approximation of the truth, and we get ever closer to the truth. So we try to reconstruct this Proto-Indo-European language. Let's talk now a bit about the history of this science is perhaps a tall term, but this discipline of Indo-European historical and comparative linguistics. The unity of the Indo-European languages was suspected already since the 16th century. The first travelers from Europe who came to India, mainly to do business on the shores of Gujarat, Maharashtra, they found that some words were common between their own language and the local Gujarati, Marathi, Konkani languages. Starting with the numerals or the pronouns, it's very easy. And so they found something in common. They did not yet think through what this might mean. But the difference between the closer relation of, for instance, Italian and Konkani was conspicuous because it contrasted with the lack of such connections between, let's say, Italian and Arabic, or Italian and the African languages. Most of these people who came to India had by then already acquired experiences with a number of other languages, which were totally gibberish to them. Whereas these Indian languages, there they recognized quite a few things. Now, such stray little discoveries were put together and worked out by a few French Jesuits working in India, mainly and finally Gaston Laurent Coeurdoux, who put together a so-called memoir, a paper, which he sent to the Academy of Sciences in Paris in 1767. That is probably the first explanation of the unity or the kinship between the Indo-European languages. That was only something known to a few scholars. The official birth towards the public at large of the notion of Indo-European was a lecture by William Jones, a judge for the British East India Company, given in Kolkata in 1786. The whole idea of kinship, which he very much acknowledged in very poetic terms, in glowing terms. He was enthusiastic for having discovered Sanskrit and then seeing that it is cognate with Latin and Greek, except that it is more perfect than Latin and Greek. He was extremely positive about Sanskrit, and he perfectly acknowledged that it was Sanskrit that had made these insights into the kinship between Greek, Germanic, Iranian, and so on possible. Yet, this theory has been rejected and is still rejected by very many Hindus because apparently they think that comparison, and so comparison between their own lofty Sanskrit language and anything else, especially anything foreign, that this is demeaning for Sanskrit. The whole idea that there could be any relation between anything pure Indian and anything barbaric foreign, that is anathema to them. And so that opinion is not universal in India, but I have noticed that it is still quite widespread. So I think that the arguments for a commonality are too numerous. I'm not saying anything here. Scholars have been saying it since the 18th century. Now, that idea of linguistic kinship between India and Europe emerged at a time when the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, was very favorable. Among intellectuals in Europe, emancipating themselves from the influence of the Bible, of Christianity, there was a veritable Indomania. They loved things Indian, and the very influential thinker of the time, the French freethinker Voltaire, did explicitly trace European culture to India. Similar ideas you'll find among the perhaps most important European philosopher Immanuel Kant, and also with the romantic thinker Johann Herder. So they emancipated themselves from the biblical view. At the same time, they still thought that European culture had to come from elsewhere or have its most important ideas from elsewhere. They were used to tracing it all to the Bible, to Jerusalem. Now they wanted to trace it to India. It was assumed in the beginning that Sanskrit was, if not the mother of all the Indo-European languages, at very least the oldest sister. This was because it just looked more ancient, if more ancient means more complex. We can see, for example, that Latin has evolved into Italian, that Latin had 6 declension cases, Italian has none. Now, if you go back, you expect to find more of them. And effectively, Sanskrit had 8 declension cases. So Latin lost 2 of them, Greek lost 3 of them. But both have a few remainders, a few reminiscences of the old instrumental case, which exists in Sanskrit, and the locative case, which also exists in Sanskrit. For example, Latin does not have the locative, but it still has the word domi, which is the locative of domus. Domi means at home. So mostly this is expressed by another declension case, principally the ablative, but originally it was in the locative. You can still see it in Latin in a few cases. The case is no longer systematically used. Similarly, Sanskrit had 3 numbers. It did not only have a singular and a plural, but also a dual. Again, you find a few remainders of this dual in Latin and Greek, but it's no longer systematically used. So it seemed that Sanskrit was an older form of the language, and that some of the complexities still present in Sanskrit had disappeared in Latin, Greek, and the rest. Now, it was therefore assumed that the original homeland of Proto-Indo-European must be very close to India or must be India itself. So from the closeness between the Indian languages and Proto-Indo-European, a geographical closeness between the homeland and India was deduced. And so if the beginning was in India, then all these European languages arrived in Europe by emigrating from India. This was said explicitly, for instance, in the book Language and Wisdom of the Indians, written in 1808 by Friedrich von Schlegel. So in the first half century, around the year 1800, of this realization of an Indo-European language family, the out of India theory was prevalent. The term out of India theory was coined only in 1996, very probably by Edwin Bryant, American. But this theory that located the homeland in India was much older and was in fact the very first theory about the homeland. So originally they located the homeland in India. However, in succeeding or in subsequent decades, India as a homeland gave way to more westerly homelands. First Bactria, Afghanistan, which is too close, then farther west, Russia, Germany, the Balkans, even Atlantis, putative island in the Atlantic Ocean. You see, all kinds of westerly homelands were proposed. And if the whole thing had started that far west, then Sanskrit had only arrived in India by invading or by immigrating into India. So that is called the Aryan invasion theory. In fact, it is many theories. It's the Russian homeland theory, the Anatolian homeland theory, and so on. But all of them imply an invasion into India. So from the Indian viewpoint, it is called the Aryan invasion theory. This followed from developing linguistic insights. It was realized that, after all, Sanskrit was not identical to Proto-Indo-European. For example, you have the Latin and Greek word for 8, the numeral 8, which is octo, and you have the related numeral for 8 in Sanskrit, which is ashta. Now, it was thought that all the different forms for 8 in each of the different languages, Baltic, Slavic, and so on, could far better be explained by supposing that the original form was octo and not ashta, and that ashta itself had evolved from octo, namely by two phenomena, two types of development. On the one hand, the vowels O, E, and A had collapsed into a single vowel A. And then secondly, the letter K, as in kentum, or here in octo, had evolved into ch or sh, like in the Satam languages. So ashta is an evolute of octo. Similarly, you have a verb form gegoma, he came. That's the original one. That seems to have evolved into jegoma and finally jagama. So the different vowels collapsed into a single vowel. Gegoma became jagama. And so the Sanskrit form jagama has evolved from the original gegoma. So that way it was thought there is a distance between the original Proto-Indo-European and the Sanskrit language. Now this, somewhat illogically, somewhat unjustifiably, was translated into the assumption that there must also have been a geographical distance between the homeland and India. See, there is in fact no reason to think so. Languages evolve even when they stay in the same place. Latin has become Italian even while staying in the same place. Anyway, that's what they thought. So that's how the favorite homeland theory evolved. So they thought it was outside of India, more to its west. And this was the Aryan invasion theory. So it could be a Bactrian homeland, as for instance Friedrich Max Müller thought, but it could be German, Balkanic, Anatolian. And since the 1970s, the favorite has become the Pontic homeland. Pontus is the area of eastern Ukraine, western Russia, the area north of and in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, just west of the Urals. So the absolute southeastern corner of Europe. Around 1920, archaeologists, meanwhile, discovered the Harappan civilization, or what is now known as the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. These were cities first discovered in West Punjab, which is now Pakistan, West Punjab and Sindh, so Harappa in West Punjab, Sindh, Mohenjo-daro in Sindh, both on the Indus River. That's why originally it was called the Indus civilization. But then many more cities were discovered, all the way south to Gujarat, and then all the way to the northeast, all of Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh. And there very many cities were discovered, so as a whole the population of this area is many more than that of Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. Those were contemporary civilizations. We are speaking here of the third millennium, about ending 1900 BC, when probably some ecological catastrophe led to these cities being abandoned. That has been established archaeologically. Now, the theorists of an Aryan invasion started connecting the dots. They tried to connect the Aryan invasion with the decline and disappearance of this Harappan civilization. So at first they thought, oh, it is the invading Aryans who destroyed all the cities. That must have been a very large work. There were very many cities over a very large expanse. So these Aryans must have been really many, which is strange if they came from an empty place like Central Asia. But okay, that was the theory. Later, they rethought the theory and they said, well, no, there is clearly a distance between the disappearance of Harappa and the arrival of the Aryans. There must be some time between them. So they thought, well, the cities disappeared in 1900 BC. The Aryans arrived in a relatively empty land in about 1500 BC, which happens to be the date that had been proposed by Max Müller a few decades earlier. And so he later admitted that he wasn't sure at all, that this was a wild guess, but nevertheless by that time everybody had accepted it. It had become a classical date, and so now it was also, so to say, confirmed by the discovery of these Harappan cities and their disappearance. So for about 150 years, we've had the Aryan invasion theory reigning supreme, but the out of India theory has revived, and this started in 1982 with the publication of a book by K.D. Setna, at that time already a very old man who in his younger days had been the secretary of the Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo had never really believed in the Aryan invasion theory, but he did not work in that field. He did not participate in that discussion. But so K.D. Setna continues his thought and claims to have discovered some evidence that might undermine the Aryan invasion theory. The book is called Karpasa. Karpasa means cotton. And it explains that cotton is strangely absent from the Rig Veda, from these books of the oldest Indian literature, which was written in exactly the same area where you had these Harappan cities. Yet in the Harappan cities it was already known. So he thought, you see, the Rig Veda is not from 1500 BC and later, that is after the Harappan cities, because then the writers of the Rig Veda would have known of cotton. No, you see, the Rig Veda was written before the Harappan cities, which started flourishing in around 2600 BC. So the Rig Veda was from about 3000 BC, maybe even earlier. And the main center described in the Rig Veda was in the cities along the cities or dwellings, habitats along the Saraswati River, which is in Haryana, is the present-day Ghaggar. At that time, it seems to have been a big river supporting a large population living on its banks. This Saraswati is not, as is sometimes claimed, a wild invention of fanatical Hindu nationalists, as is now claimed by defenders of the Aryan invasion theory. In fact, scholars, perfectly decent European scholars, have already described the Saraswati and postulated its importance for this history since the 1850s. All this has been mapped out by Michel Danino, an Indian scientist of French origin. So he has shown, he has documented all this and put together his conclusions in a book, The Invasion That Never Was, given all the archaeological evidence for the lack of any sign of an invasion, for, on the contrary, evidence for perfect continuity of these Harappan cities. You see, when they disappear, the same culture remains, but at a lower technological level, but it's the same people using the same techniques and so on. So there is no indication that there was any invasion. You know, unless, of course, you can assume that they invaded under the radar, but they have left no trace. If there were any invaders at all, they have managed not to leave a trace of their invasion, yet completely transform a very densely populated, very cultured area. What this out of India theory effectively says is that the Vedas were written just west of what is now Delhi, in the Saraswati area. They show a gradient from east to west. The oldest layers of the Rig Veda show a familiarity with the Ganga, and know only just of the Saraswati River, not farther west, not yet even Punjab. Then later they expand into Punjab. Then finally in the 8th book, they become very familiar with Afghanistan. And so then they are ready for an outflow into Central Asia. And it's about that time also that they situate the migration of the Iranians from India into Central Asia. And so, if we are to believe the out of India theory, earlier emigrations of the people who later became Germanic speaking, Celtic speaking, Greek speaking, and so on, happened a little earlier. So Rig Veda written, let's say 3000 BC. So emigration starting in about 3700 BC, which is the date given by all the other scholars, the linguists, for the ultimate disintegration of the original Proto-Indo-European unity. And so the Vedas are not construed as the ultimate, as written or composed in the ultimate homeland. They are already in some kind of a colony, with the ultimate homeland being located a bit to their east, a bit east of what is now Delhi, in present-day Uttar Pradesh. So, if you want to know what the homeland of Indo-European was, the out of India theory says it was in present-day Uttar Pradesh. Now, linguistic evidence. The idea of a language family was not, as deplorably some Hindu nationalists claim, was not concocted by colonialists or missionaries with ugly, evil designs. No, you see, it was thought up in a library somewhere in Northern Europe, or in Germany, or in Hungary, by a few scholars who mapped out a different language theory about the Uralic languages. And so they put together Hungarian and Finnish, which are two very different languages at first sight, showed that they were actually cognate. Similarly, Estonian, Samoyedic, Lappic, and a number of other languages still spoken nowadays in Russia. Altogether fairly marginal. There was no racial angle to it. They were all white people, both the speakers of these languages and the scholars who put together their kinship. There was no colonial angle to it either. It was simply the exercise of their linguistic prowess, and so they discovered this language theory, which was finally mapped out definitively by Philipp Johann von Stralenberg in about 1730. Then the Indo-European language family followed a few decades later. So it unites Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Baltic, Slavic, Albanian, Greek, Armenian, Iranian, and Indo-Aryan, plus a few extinct languages, Hittite in Anatolia, Tocharian in the western Chinese province of Xinjiang, Thraco-Phrygian, which was in Bulgaria, and Proto-Bangani, which was spoken in Uttarakhand in the north of India. This language family was mapped out definitively by a Jesuit missionary, Jean Calmet, and especially by his student, Gaston Laurent Coeurdeau, who has been called the father of Indo-European. So the definitive year, the breakthrough year really is 1767. But it is only in 1786 that William Jones announced to the world this linguistic kinship, which was then given the name of Indo-Germanic or Indo-European, or indeed Aryan. The word Arya, the origin of the English word Aryan, the Sanskrit word Arya, is a term by which the Paurava tribe, one of the Indian tribes, the Paurava tribe, designated itself. And this was a normal thing to designate oneself. The Iranians, the Anatolians did likewise. They called themselves or their fellow citizens Arya. So Arya means not noble, as many Indians will tell you. That is only a later meaning. The original meaning is fellow citizen, fellow countryman, or let's say just us, as against them. An-Arya, the non-Aryans, they are them. They are the outsiders, the foreigners. Very probably Arya is a derivative of the word Ari, which in classical Sanskrit comes to mean enemy. But actually, originally it meant tribal chieftain. It may be a bit difficult to conceive of why you have this range of meanings, from tribal chieftain to enemy. I suggest you think of a race where you have a front runner. The front runner is the leader, hence the meaning tribal chieftain. The front runner is the leader, but for the second, the third, and so on, he's also the man to be beaten. So in that sense, he's the enemy. Anyway, so very probably that is the ultimate origin of the word Arya. But so Arya means the real citizens of a tribe. Now, since the Vedas have been composed within this Paurava tribe that was located on the Saraswati River, and since then later these Vedas become popular among the neighboring tribes, who see this word Arya and relate it to the Vedas, Arya comes to mean Vedic, civilized according to Vedic norms, and therefore it comes to mean noble. It is also only the upper classes that receive the full Vedic initiation. So the lower classes know only a smattering of it. It is the higher classes that are fully socialized and initiated in this Vedic tradition. And so therefrom you get the meaning of elitist, of noble, of civilized. Exactly like in English, the sociological meaning of noble, of upper class, develops from sociological, meaning upper class, to a moral meaning of uprightness, or decentness, decency. Note that while it had this self-referentially ethnic meaning, and also this derived moral meaning, it neither had a linguistic meaning nor a racial meaning. There was no such thing as an Aryan language, except maybe in the sense of an elite language, as opposed to the commoner's language, the colloquial language, but it did not mean any specific language, and it did certainly not mean any specific race. The idea of the Aryan race as the white race, the Nordic race, was totally foreign to its original Sanskritic users. Conversely, in the later Vedas, you get words designating the Iranians, who had earlier been their main enemies, like Dasa, Dasyu, Pani, and Asura. They come to mean negative things like serf, in the case of Dasa, or like demon, in the case of Asura. But so their basic meaning is hostile foreigner, because for a while, first not, then yes, then again not, there was enmity between the Vedic tribe, the Pauravas, and the Iranians. So that has left its traces in Sanskrit usage ever since. The birth of Indo-European scholarship can be dated to 1816, when Franz Bopp published in Berlin his study of comparative conjugation, comparing the Sanskrit conjugation system of the verb with its Greek and Latin counterparts. Later he continued with comparative grammar with every aspect of the language, also comparing Sanskrit with its Western counterparts. And so that way we get the start of the reconstruction of this unattested ancestral language, Proto-Indo-European. This looking for this original language can never be exact. Some linguists take their reconstructions too seriously, believe wrongly that this has all been proven. No, this is a hypothesis, an ever better hypothesis, but never definitive. But it is also not a ghost language, as anti-linguists in India assume. You see, they don't believe anything of these reconstructions. They think it is just very fanciful, just an invention, moreover, one for ulterior colonial or missionary motives. Now, that is simply not true. But we cannot relate the whole history of this linguistic search. There's only one important name we will also give. It is August Schleicher, who in the years around 1870 produced a number of key ideas of Indo-European science. He is the first who really linked this original language, which was only a linguistic concept, to the idea of an ethnic group that spoke this language. Now, in reality, there was strong mixing already since the early beginning. As soon as you had an emigration from the homeland, every tribe mixed with whatever population he found. And so different groups mixed with different languages that they found. That's why their own languages, their own dialects grew apart rather fast. And you got very distinct languages, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and so on, because each of them had mixed with a different non-Indo-European population. So very soon, you see, there was lots of mixing. There was certainly no purity. I mean, this is perhaps never to be sought for in the history of a language, but it was certainly not applicable to Indo-European, which was anything but racially pure. Schleicher is also the man who advocated the polygenesis of languages. This is deemed to, well, it does say that languages do not all have a common origin. Some languages are, for example, Indo-European, others are Semitic, others are Sino-Tibetan, others are Amerindian, and he didn't see any common origin. This idea has somewhat been discarded. It is assumed now that there are about 40 different roots that are common to all languages in the world, or at least all language groups. Like, for instance, you have the word for milk in English. You see, this goes back to a root, milk, something like that. And so that in different languages has related meanings that all go back to the empirical phenomenon of a child sucking at its mother's breast. So it can mean milk, it can mean throat, it can mean drink, it can mean breast. All these related meanings may have persisted in one of the different languages of mankind. So you see, such roots can be found almost everywhere, with vaguely, distantly related meanings. Anyway, this idea of polygenesis of languages was later to contribute to a political usage of this Indo-European language theory, namely by the National Socialists in Germany, who made far too much of this difference between, for example, Indo-European, or as it was called then, Aryan, and on the other hand, Semitic, including the language of the Jews. Well, he is mainly remembered now for writing a story in Proto-Indo-European. This is the story called Avis Aquasas Ka. You might recognize a few words. Avi exists in Sanskrit, means sheep. Looks like Latin ovis, which also means sheep, which is related to the English word ewe, which means a female sheep. Then aquasas seems to be the accusative plural of a word aquas, which means horse. This looks like Latin equus, but it also looks like Sanskrit ashwa. And then ka at the end. Ka is the copula, is a word that links the former two. It is like Latin que, and it is like Sanskrit cha, right? So it means the sheep and the horses. It is still very Sanskrit looking. For instance, later, and today especially, linguists would say that the original form was ovis, and it was retained in Latin, ovis, and it was changed in Sanskrit, becoming avi. In those days, Schleicher still thought the reverse. He thought that the Sanskrit form was the original one, and the Latin was the evolved one. Similarly, aquas, you see, has the vowels of Sanskrit, ashwa, though it also still has the consonants of the Latin equus. But so it's still half Sanskrit, half Latin. The form ka has the consonant of the Latin, que, more or less, but the vowel of the Sanskrit, cha. So this is part of an evolving search for what this Indo-European must have looked like. But you see, at that time, Proto-Indo-European still looks quite a bit like Sanskrit. The story, I'll briefly say what it is about. So a sheep that is shorn, that has no wool, sees horses, and these horses, one of them is pulling a heavy wagon, one is carrying a big load, one is carrying a man quickly. And the sheep says to the horses, "My heart pains me to see a man driving horses." But the horses answered, "Listen, sheep, our hearts pain us when we see this. A man, the master, makes the wool of a sheep into a warm garment for himself, while the sheep has no wool." Having heard this, the sheep fled into the plain. The plain meaning the meadow, not the airplane, of course. So if you rewrite that story into what is now thought to be Proto-Indo-European, it looks very different. But still, you see the idea that after all, Proto-Indo-European must have been a living language, and that stories can be told in it, that was already there. Today you actually have websites where all writing is done in putative Proto-Indo-European. Schleicher also thought of the Stammbaum theory, the theory of a genealogical tree, where all the languages were like branches of a tree, ultimately going back to a root, which is the mother tongue, the ancestral language. Against that, a certain Johannes Schmidt thought of the Wellen theory, the wave theory, which emphasized that languages are not only determined by their ancestry, they are also continually evolving due to the influence of their neighborhood. You can see it today. For instance, you have many English terms for new computer phenomena or for new business phenomena, and they spread, they are taken over in many languages, either literally or through literal translations. And so you get an influence on other languages, and all the languages in one particular area end up having this borrowed feature. So that is, of course, also something that exists, something that you can observe every day. Languages evolve and are influenced by their environment. However, that is only a secondary phenomenon. It's real, but it's not as important as the main tendency of languages to preserve whatever they have inherited. Okay, in this history of the search for the perfect Indo-European reconstruction, we now get the name of Friedrich Max Müller. Very important. In India, they tend to blame him for everything that is wrong with this Aryan invasion theory. Now, he did believe in the Aryan invasion theory. He did believe that there was an invasion of India from probably Bactria, still very close to India. Other people thought more of Europe itself as the homeland. But anyway, it was outside India, so he definitely believed in the Aryan invasion, which he located in about 1500 BC, a date that has remained the favorite till now. In the present-day Aryan invasion theory, the favorite homeland is the Pontic homeland, the Pontus area, which is the border area between Ukraine and Russia. So it is the area north of and in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, mainly north of the Caspian Sea. And so that is in Russia called the Yamna culture. Yamna means pit grave, after an important archaeological feature there. It existed in the 3rd millennium BC, and it lies just in the middle between the two extremes of the Indo-European expansion. On the one hand, you have the Atlantic coast. On the other hand, you have the coast of the Bay of Bengal. And so this homeland, the Pontic area, is just halfway. And many scholars, even scholars, let alone commoners, think that this is a strong argument in favor of this homeland, that it is just halfway. And of course, you see, this homeland has something going for it. In Europe, you do see a lot of migration happening in the 3rd millennium. You see a lot of migration coming from this Yamna culture, this pit grave culture, going all through Europe, ultimately ending up on the Atlantic coast, taking everything before it. There's a lot of new pottery, all kinds of archaeological evidence. There's a new physical type coming in, which is now confirmed with genetic researches. So there you really find an Aryan invasion. And so of this new population, it can be fairly certainly be established that later this turns out to be a population speaking Celtic, Germanic, and so on, speaking Indo-European. So in Europe, you have all the signs of an Aryan invasion. That precisely is completely lacking in India. But for Europe, you can say, yes, this theory of an origin in the Yamna culture in the Pontic area, that is fairly well established. Unfortunately, this Yamna culture comes a little bit too late. And so some scholars, some leading Indo-European scholars, like Paul Haggerty, for example, have said that this was only a secondary homeland. This was already a colony. The first Indo-European speaking peoples came to the Yamna area, settled there for a while, became numerous, became strong, and then invaded the lands farther west. Now, where did they come from? Haggerty, for example, probably thinks they came from Anatolia. This is one theory developed by Renfrew in the 1980s thereabouts, thinking that it is this homeland of agriculture, Anatolia, that spread the technique of agriculture along with the Indo-European language. Now, most linguists firmly reject this theory, as do I. But at any rate, it is said that either from Anatolia or from somewhere else, people came to the Yamna area and then from there only invaded Europe and colonized and Indo-Europeanized Europe. Now this other candidate for an original primary homeland, I think, is India. But people say, yes, but there is this symmetry. This Pontic area is nicely in the middle. You see, you could have two migrations, one westward and one eastward. But in fact, that is a strong argument against it, because actually this never happens. Languages that expand do not expand symmetrically. In fact, all the languages of which we know a spectacular expansion start from one far corner of their ultimate expanse. This is true, for instance, of the to start with fairly modern languages of Russian, for example, which is known to have started in the area around Kiev, Ukraine, which did not expand 1 mile west, but which expanded eastwards all the way to Alaska, like 10 time zones, half the world. Arabic expanded from Arabia, not 1 mile to the east, but all the way to Morocco in the west. Similarly, the Bantu languages expanded from about Nigeria, West Africa, southeastwards all the way to the Cape, and not to the north at all. And this is in fact quite explainable why the Bantu language family was the language of the first culture in Africa that practiced agriculture. Now, to practice agriculture, you need fertile soil with some amount of sun and some amount of rain. There is plenty of that in Central and Southern Africa. By contrast, if you go north, you end up in the Sahara, in the desert, where you can't practice agriculture. So they had their very practical reasons to expand southwards and not northwards. And so similarly, for one reason or another, there is always something that makes a symmetrical migration unlikely. So it is far more probable that the migration started in one far corner, and since it was definitely not Europe, I would suggest it is India. People started in India and went all the way west to the Atlantic coast. Moreover, Central Asia is not exactly a demographic giant. It is not now, it was even less then. When India, by contrast, was a very thickly populated, very densely populated. And so, if anything happened in India that caused an emigration, whether it was a famine or a political crisis, a civil war or something, so some group leaves, that group may be a very tiny minority in India, but that suddenly becomes a very large group, a majority in empty Central Asia. So India is a fairly logical place to start this expansion. And by contrast, if there is any immigration into India, it will be a relatively small group. Even if it's a large group in Central Asia, by Central Asian standards, it will still be small and marginal in India. So again, its potential for changing the native language of a far, far, far more numerous and more cultured population is just simply very unlikely. Then there is the question of loan words. By loan words, by exchange of vocabulary with neighboring languages, you might be able to see what is the original place. In Europe, you have hardly anything to compare with. Apart from Indo-European, you have the Uralic languages that also came from the East. And you have Basque that was already there, but that has no linguistic exchanges with Proto-Indo-European. Of course, it has exchanges with the later Romance languages, but that's later, and that only shows that these other languages were newcomers. And so Europe, and nobody suggests that Europe is the homeland. The farthest west that they now accept as homeland might be Poland, in the theory of Lothar Kilian, but so not the Basque area at all. So in Europe, you have no candidates for lexical exchange with Proto-Indo-European. But do you have them in India? Well, there is a Russian scholar called Igor Tonoyan Belyayev, who is familiar with Tibetan, and he says, yes, there are exchanges between Tibetan and Proto-Indo-European. For example, you have a Proto-Indo-European root Peku, which means cattle or bull or cow. It is faithfully preserved in Latin, where you have a word pecus, which means cattle. And you have more or less the same word pux in Tibetan, which means cow. Now, some skeptics will say, yeah, but you see, that might be related to Sanskrit pashu. But you see, it has the same guttural consonant as pecus, namely pux, and it does not have the Sanskrit sh sound in pashu. So rather, this pux is related to the original Proto-Indo-European form and not to the later evolved form of Sanskrit, which is pashu. And so he gives a number of other examples. This is a limited form of evidence, but for what it is worth, it points to a homeland bordering on Tibet. For some other evidence regarding loan words, there are hundreds of loans from Iranian into Uralic. There aren't any the other way around. Now, if the Iranians, together with the Indians, had trekked from the homeland in western Russia through the Uralic area to the east to Iran and India, then there would have been a two-way exchange. There would have been Indo-Iranian words in Uralic, and there would have been borrowings from Uralic into Iranian or Indo-Aryan. That is not the case. What we have instead is that the Iranians at some point, about 1000 BC, colonized Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and there met the Uralic people a lot of the time. The Uralic people were culturally, or felt culturally, more inferior. They were reindeer herds, whereas the Iranians started practicing agriculture. You see, they started building cities and so on. They had a relatively modern society for those days. And so they colonized the Uralic populations. They imparted their vocabulary and not the other way around. Or maybe somewhat the other way around, but only locally. These Iranians never transmitted their words to the heartland of Afghanistan, Iran, let alone India. Why? Well, because they came from there. They weren't on their way to Iran, to India. No, they came from ultimately Afghanistan and then farther back, more anciently even India. So the evidence for the Aryan invasion theory that you could have expected just simply fails to show up. Then there is the absence of loan words that may be significant. The dog that didn't bark. River names elsewhere outside India are often borrowed from some known or completely disappeared pre-Indo-European language. In northwestern India, by contrast, they are all pure Sanskrit. Now, the Aryan invasion defenders might say, yes, this is true, they are all pure Sanskrit. This is admitted by famous scholars like Michael Witzel, for instance, who defend the Aryan invasion, but who nevertheless acknowledge the fact that where you would have expected loan words, you find pure Sanskrit, namely in the river names in northern India. Now, some people say, and this has in fact been proposed by Václav Blažek, another important Indo-Europeanist, maybe this Sanskrit is only a surface that hides the Sanskritization of foreign words. You find this also in later history. For example, you have the name Burma of India's eastern neighbor country. Burma, this is Sino-Tibetan. This is a completely foreign language. And so it is Sanskritized by Indians as Brahmadesh. And now, if you hear that the country's name is Brahmadesh, you would say, this is pure Sanskrit. This proves that Burma was originally Sanskrit speaking. Well, no, they have their own name, foreign to Sanskrit, but which has been superficially Sanskritized. So maybe that has happened with these rivers too. Well, that's an interesting hypothesis, only there are no indications for it. You can't prove it. There are no contemporary records, not by 5,000 years, that would put Burushaski or Dravidian or whatever in North India. Then it's also remarkable that the early Vedic language has no loans from Dravidian. It is very commonly claimed that the original language of the Harappan cities was Dravidian. In that case, it would have left traces in early Vedic. Well, it doesn't. Sanskrit only starts borrowing from Dravidian, words like, for instance, Meena, which means fish, that still exists in Tamil with that meaning, or Kana, which means one-eyed, and so on. There are a number of Dravidian loans in Sanskrit, but that's only in later Sanskrit. That comes only when Sanskrit starts expanding southwards, when there is a mutual exchange of words. Many Sanskrit words go into Dravidian, and some also go the other way. We already mentioned the scholar Michael Witzel from Harvard. He claims that Sanskrit has borrowed words from the Bactrian-Margiana archaeological complex, which is a long word for saying Bactria. So in northern Afghanistan, eastern Turkmenistan, there was a bit of an urban civilization, maybe around 2000 BC. And so in the Aryan invasion scenario, this would be a logical staging ground for the Aryan invasion. First, they regrouped in Bactria, and then from there, finally, they entered India. So there are a few words like that. Ishtaka means brick, or Parsha, which means a sheaf of grain. Now, this Ishtaka is in fact only a late Vedic word. It is not attested in the early books of the Rig Veda, only in the later ones. So it is strange that people are coming in to India, they do not know of these bricks, and then centuries later suddenly they do. So that is very improbable that is originally a Bactrian word. As for Parsha, this is simply an Indo-European word. You find it in Greek in the word perse, which means sheaf. Another pre-Indo-European language that Witzel suggests is Paramunda. Paramunda means words that are structurally similar to Munda, even though they are not being attested in Munda. In Munda, you have a number of typical prefixes like ka and ku and so on. And you find these back in a number of Sanskrit words that do not exist in the vocabulary of the other branches, Germanic, Greek, and so on. For instance, you have the well-known word Kumara, meaning a young man. So it is not that you find the same word in the Munda languages, in Santali, Mundari, and so on, that are spoken in the east of India. But it has that same structure. It might be something related. Okay, well, maybe that's true. It's not proven at all, but it could very well be true. We have no problem with this scenario, because of course, Indo-European did borrow words. It met new neighbors. It also expanded within India. it did not cover all of India. And so, yes, there was a certain immigration, not into India, but into some areas of India where new languages were spoken, including these Paramunda languages, and so new words were borrowed, while at the other end, in the northwest of India, people were trickling out and emigrating and missing out on this borrowing of new words. So some branches of Indo-European do not have these borrowed, supposedly Paramunda words, while Sanskrit does have them. In 1859, the Swiss linguist Adolf Pictet came out with a theory of linguistic paleontology. That is the idea that from the vocabulary of an ancient language, you can reconstruct the kind of environment in which it was spoken. For example, you have the words wolf, bear, and lynx, which are pan-Indo-European words, and they seem to prove a cold northerly origin. Where else would you find a wolf or a bear? Now, this has largely been discarded. Why? For example, for several reasons, but one of them is the cold exists in hot countries as well, namely in islands of cold climate that are the mountains. And so in its more elevated areas, India does have bears, does have wolves. Moreover, and this is not often realized, hot climate animals have been attested just as well. The ape, for example, the leopard, even the elephant. Now, as for elephants, there is only one Indo-European speaking country that has elephants, and it is India. Another argument against linguistic paleontology is that words change their meaning with a changing environment. So if they move from a country where a particular tree exists to a country where it doesn't exist, what then happens is that that same word will be applied to a different tree. Or animal, for example, this word for elephant that we just mentioned, this lost its original meaning when the Germanic people moved to Central Asia. But there they met the camel, and so the Gothic word ulbandhus, related to elephant, means camel. However, in spite of these limitations on linguistic paleontology, sometimes it is a good idea. For example, we are pretty sure that the Indo-Europeans, before they split up into different daughter languages, that jointly they already had a very important invention, namely the cart or the wagon. This we know because 6 different routes indicating parts of the car, the axle, the wheel, and so on, the yoke, they exist throughout all branches of Indo-European. So they describe a technology that existed before Indo-European split up. In my opinion, it is the wheel and the cart that are the secret of the success of Proto-Indo-European. It spread far and wide, all the way from the Gulf of Bengal to the Atlantic coast. And part of its success was the wagon, because that allowed for fast migration, not only of bands of young men who set out to conquer new territory, who often succeeded, but then they married local women, their children were brought up in a foreign language, and soon the conquerors, even though they were in power, lost their language. In this case, they could keep their language because they took their families with them. In wagons, you could transport women and children. And so you could keep the social setting in which you could let your language thrive. Another success of linguistic paleontology is a negative one, indicating an absence. Even invasionists, like for instance Arnaud Fournet, say that the horse, which in the past was often associated with Indo-European expansion, was actually absent from its homeland. Now, from Xinjiang with the Tocharians all the way to the Atlantic coast with the Celtic, Germanic, Italic peoples, you have horses everywhere. The only place where you did not have indigenous horses was India. So the homeland did have elephants, did not have horses. What else can that be than India? Another linguistic argument pertains to the isoglosses. Aha, that's a new word. It means a common change from Proto-Indo-European in the daughter languages, namely in common between some of the daughter languages, but different from other daughter languages. So thereby you can see that a few daughters remain together undergoing the same changes while already having split off from these other daughter languages. For example, we have, for instance, the original word penque, which means five, Sanskrit pancha, Greek pente. Now, in both Italic or Latin and Celtic, you find that there is a rule that if this qu sound, gets redoubled if preceded by a p, this penque becomes quenque. And so you get Latin quinque, which you find in English words like quinquennial, meaning every 5 years. Or old Irish coic, where you do not have poic as you should have, but coic. And so thereby you know that there is an Italo-Celtic isogloss. The same development has taken place in Latin and in Celtic, and not in Germanic, in Greek, or any of the other languages. Or a very famous case is the division between Kentum and Satem languages. So originally you had a sound somewhat like Kentum, meaning 100. That sound pattern has been preserved in Hittite, Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Greek, Tocharian, but it has changed to Shata or Satem, something similar, in Baltic, Slavic, Armenian, Indo-Aryan, and Iranian. In this case, it is very easy to discover the arrow, to know what is the original and what is the evolved one, because this change from k to ch you find in very many languages all over the earth. You find it, for instance, in Chinese, from Peking to Beijing. And so in this case, it is most likely that the arrow points in the same direction. So Kentum is the original form, Shatam is the evolved form. So languages that have left the homeland will have preserved the ancient form, whereas those that stay together in the homeland will have evolved the ch form, the Satem form. And then later some of them also emigrated. So the original homeland, once more, must be somewhere in the Shatam area. Now the Shatam area is very large. It can be Russia, as the Aryan invasionists nowadays say, but it could also be India or anywhere in between. Okay, why do I explain this principle of isoglosses? There are a few applications of this principle of isoglosses that again plead in favor of India as the homeland, or that at least plead against a more westerly homeland. First, you have these Kentum languages that we just mentioned. So there is a Tocharian, spoken near India, and Proto-Bangani, spoken inside India. And they have this old Kentum form, not the new Satem form. So that indicates, is again not proof, but it indicates that probably these languages were originally spoken in the East, in or very near India. Then there is a certain commonality. There are a number of isoglosses uniting Greek, Armenian, Iranian, and sometimes Indo-Aryan. For example, you have an augment in the past tense in Greek as well as in Sanskrit. In Greek verbs, for instance, you have a verb leipo, which gives elipon, I left. You see, you have this augment, this initial vowel, lexa. I read from Lego, so you have an added initial vowel lexa, and this a becomes I in Sanskrit, but in Sanskrit you have the same thing. When it's agamat, he went. You also have a negative word, ma or me, which means don't. Again, you have that in common between Sanskrit and Greek, not in the other Indo-European languages. Or, for instance, you have a changeover from S to H. Like, for instance, you have septem in Latin, for example, meaning seven. Now, in Greek, this becomes a hepta. In Iranian, this becomes a hafta. And even in some of the most westerly Indo-Aryan dialects. And you have some leftovers of it, like in Hindi. The number 70 is in Hindi satar, but 71 is ikhatar, not iksatar. So the interesting thing about these isoglosses is that they make it very unlikely that both Greek, Greek and Indo-Iranian left from a Russian homeland, because that means that Greek went west and Indo-Iranian went east, and yet they underwent a common development, making septum into hepta or hafta. It is far more likely that they stayed together, that after leaving the homeland, or at least after leaving the Proto-Indo-European stage, Greek and Iranian, Indo-Iranian, stayed together for a while, underwent these innovations, and only then went their separate ways. But that means that Russia cannot be the homeland, whereas India can. Other types of evidence. Are there any loans with other languages in the Rig Veda? Maybe there are. It has very long already been observed that the word pana, indicating a unit of weight or currency, seems to be the same as the Sumerian word bana. It has also been said, this I have never checked, that the Rig Vedic word bekanata, meaning a trader or specifically a moneylender, is actually a word coming from Babylon. That I don't know. But so it is reasonably said that even the Rig Veda, the purest Indo-European text with the least loans, shows a certain familiarity with Mesopotamians coming to India. Is there any astronomical evidence? Yes, of course there is. There is in fact quite a bit of it, though there aren't many astronomical indications in the Vedic literature itself, but they are very consistent. That is to say, if an older text gives an older astronomical date than in a younger text, a text which, for example, describes the seers of the older text as the ancestors of this text's seers, then the younger text turns out to have a younger astronomical date. So it is consistent. They were not just inventing things. They were describing astronomical observations that they themselves did. Now, these astronomical observations point consistently to a higher chronology than the Aryan invasion theory allows for. For example, in the Vedanga Jyotisha, which is a text on observational astronomy, they were certainly not reminiscing observations of their ancestors. No, they were describing what they saw. That text dates itself twice in two different manners to the 14th century BC. Namely, it describes what star is crossing the solstice axis or the equinox axis. And so stars cross this any point on the zodiac at a speed of 1 degree per 71 years, or the whole circle round 360 degrees in about 25,800 years. So on that time scale, you can easily determine when an event that is indicated, that is described, took place. So this post-Vedic text, the Vedanga Jyotisha, which was written when the Vedic corpus was already complete, dates itself to about 1350 BC. Now that is when, according to the Aryan invasion theory, the Rig Veda was hardly being written. A Rig Veda, which is like 1,000 years or so older than the Vedanga Jyotisha. Another example, the Kaushitaki Brahmana, as well as the Atharva Veda, have a description of the star Magha, which is Regulus, the heart of the lion, crossing the solstice axis in about 2300 BC. Or they describe this position of the star, and we can back calculate that this must have been in 2300 BC. Now the Kaushitaki Brahmana and the Atharva Veda are already later texts than the Rig Veda. So the Rig Veda again is confirmed to be 2500, 3000 BC. Totally incompatible with the Aryan invasion theory. Similarly, the Mahabharata, which is a text attributed to Veda Vyasa, who is supposed to have edited the Vedas, is dated astronomically to some 1500 BC, to somewhere in the middle of the second millennium. And that is a text that presupposes the Vedas, which therefore must have been written earlier, 2300 BC, 2000 or 3000 BC. And so with these astronomical indications, you get a very consistent picture that consistently points to a much higher chronology than the Aryan invasion theory. There is not a single astro reference that supports the Aryan invasion theory. Then there is the archaeological evidence. We already knew that the Harappans traded much with Central Asia. A lot of Harappan jewelry has been found there. So the Central Asian area was quite familiar to them. It was a logical place to go to if ever they had to leave India. But after a century of Harappan archaeology, the theory of Aryan invasion that has absorbed all the funds, that was always sought to be confirmed by archaeological evidence, that has yielded no trace at all, not a single one, of an Aryan invasion into, or an Aryan immigration into India. The Dean of Indian Archaeology, namely B.B. Lal, who is now in his 90s, he made his name in the 50s as a young archaeologist by positing that a typical type of pottery, the painted grey ware, was significant for the Aryan population on its way deeper into India. And he was able to date that to about, well, the middle of the second millennium BC. That has functioned as a kind of Piltdown link. I'm referring to the Piltdown man, a forgery that was supposed to constitute the link between modern humans and the earlier Neanderthal man. So this also plays a similar role. It provides a link between this theory of the Aryan invasion and the actual visible facts of archaeology. And that evidence is still being quoted. There are still texts appearing defending the Aryan invasion, saying, but it has been archaeologically proven by B.B. Lal. In fact, I myself in university, when studying Indo-European linguistics, asked my professor, what is the proof of this Aryan invasion? He said, well, you see, as a linguist, I have no proof to offer. However, the archaeologists have proven it. Well, the archaeologists have not proven it. B.B. Lal has retracted this. He has admitted, well, you see, I was young. I was still under the impression of this omnipresent Aryan invasion theory. So I fitted my findings into the existing paradigm. But later I realized there is nothing about this painted grey ware that has the name Aryan on it or the name invader on it. And so he says now, and here I literally quote him, and I've heard him say it myself. He has also written it in a number of recent books. The Vedic literature and the Harappan archaeological findings are two sides of the same coin. He very explicitly rejects the Aryan invasion theory. And that is the mainstream opinion among Indian archaeologists. I've been at conferences where a number of specialists were reporting from their own excavations at their own Harappan site. Each of them says there is no trace at all of an invasion. Now, there is this special pleading on the Aryan invasion theory side, saying, yeah, but the Aryans may have invaded under the radar. Maybe they managed to change the civilization so completely that it forgot its own language, adopted the invaders' language, and nevertheless not be noticed. Now you should contrast this with the very dramatic evidence of an Aryan invasion in Central and Western Europe in the 3rd millennium BC. You see, in Europe, there you have the evidence of an Aryan invasion. In India, you have not. Then there is the genetical evidence. A lot has been made of it recently, and here I have to confess ignorance. I know very little about this genetics. I know about polemics about history, and I know all the tricks, and I can recognize when a trick is played on us. And so I have my own idea of this this debate, this use of genetic arguments. However, I am fairly skeptical about the whole relevance of genetic evidence, because genes don't speak. You know, you may be able to prove a migration, but then you still don't know what those people speak. Indeed, this is the story of India. You have plenty of invasions in India, or immigrations. You have the Shakas, the Hunas, the Kushanas, the Greeks, the Turks, the Afghans. You have immigrations as refugees of the Parsis, of the Syrian Christians. And yet not a single one of these groups maintained its own language. They all assimilated, at least linguistically. Many of them also culturally. They are indistinguishable from the rest of the Indian population. The Muslims are culturally distinct, but again, linguistically, they have largely adapted. So if all those people did that, what makes these supposed Aryans, supposing that they can be identified genetically, what made them so different that they, as a little band of horse-born warriors, managed to impose their language on a vastly larger and more cultured population? That is for the Aryan Invasion Party to explain. Let me note also, it's just a funny little detail, but it might be significant, that in Ukraine they have found in genetic analysis of the cows over there that they are partly descended from Indian cows. Now, cows don't migrate just anywhere. You see, for cows to cross the Hindu Kush mountains, these very high mountain passes, they don't do that of their own volition. They only do that when they are forced to do it by human beings. So we know that there was a migration of people, of cowherds from India to the west as far as Ukraine. Now, I am not saying that this proves the out of India theory, but it might, you see, it could be an indication in that direction. Then there is the comparative mythological evidence. You find very many themes in myths of Europeans and Indians to be the same. Like, for example, the myth of the dragon slayer is quite universal. Zeus in Greece slays the dragon Typhon. The son of the thunder god named Siegfried, he slays the dragon in Germany. Then Indra slays the dragon Vrtra in the Vedas, and so on. So they all have it. Or something more complex, you have the idea of a creation by the slaying of a twin brother. So you have originally two brothers called Meno and Yemo, which in Indian becomes Manu and Yama. And so the one kills the other and uses his body to create the different parts of the universe. You find this story of the creation of the universe with the skull as the heavenly vault, with the feet as the earthly expanse, the blood as the rivers, the bones as the mountains, and so on. You find this very explicitly in the Germanic myth of Ymir. But you find something very similar in the Vedas, in the Purusha Sukta, where both the universe and also human society are both compared to the human body. This Menu creates, Yemo gives his body parts to become whatever is newly created. You find a version of that in Rome, where the city of Rome is created, is built by Romulus after he has killed his twin brother Remus. And Remus, the word Remus is assimilated to Romulus, starting with R, but it's in fact Yemus, right? It is Yama. And so this mortal man who dies in some versions becomes the god of mortality and therefore the god of death in the Vedic version. That's Yama. But so, in spite of a number of transformations, you can still recognize the common origin in the myths of Indian and European peoples. Or you have the story of the hero who is made invulnerable because he bathes or because he is dipped into some fluid that makes him invulnerable. You have Achilles, who is baptized, so to speak, by his mother, who holds him by his heel. So he becomes invulnerable except for his heel, which is where later he gets killed. Or you have Siegfried in Germany, who takes a bath in the blood of the dragon he has slain. He becomes invulnerable, but unfortunately there's a leaf from a tree falling on his shoulder. He's vulnerable there, and ultimately that's where he gets killed. You have the same thing with Duryodhana, the Indian hero or anti-hero, a negative hero, for whom it is his thigh that is the vulnerable part, and he gets killed there. So you have this same myth in different varieties all over India and Europe. So that is not controversial. That only confirms the kinship between the European and the Indian branches. Already a little bit more controversial is that it is very often the Indian version that allows for the recognition of kinship between two other versions, let's say the Greek version and the Celtic version. They may be very different, but you can see a common origin between them if you bring in the Sanskrit version. Now, you have, in this respect, so far we have only shown from the mythological evidence that there is a commonality, a kinship between India and Europe. But where is there anything that points in one direction that may help in this homeland debate? Again, we are not offering absolute evidence, but we are offering a strong indication. Now here I want to refer to the work of an Oxford scholar, Nick Allen. I do not want to make him responsible for the conclusions that I am drawing from his work. So let me say explicitly, he is not an out of India theorist, but nevertheless, he offers an observation that I think points very much towards India as the homeland. He makes a comparison between between a number of elements of Homer, of the Homeric epics, and the Mahabharata and Ramayana. And so there are very many elements in common, of course. Now, of all his evidence, I want to discuss specifically the comparison between the journey that Arjuna makes, that brings him from Indraprastha to the forests of the Ganga area, then to the Himalayas, and then all the way up to the heavenly city of his father, the god Indra. And this is compared with the journey made by Ulysses from Calypso's isle of Ogygia to the blissful land of Scheria. Now, and there are very many points in common, the detail, long story, but what is interesting is that Arjuna's journey is a yogic undertaking. There are many references to yoga. The hero is explicitly said to be yoked to Indra's yoga. He tries to please the god Shiva, who is the god of yoga, and he does a number of ascetic yogic exercises. In ancient Greece, these hints are absent. You see, he is also trying to please a god who, just like Shiva, has a trident, namely the god Poseidon. But there's nothing yogic about it. He's trying to please Poseidon because Poseidon is displeased with him. He has offended Poseidon, so he's trying to make up for it. Or, willy-nilly, he has to face tests imposed on him by Poseidon. And so Nick Allen points out a number of similarities, too many to be coincidental. But this is the uppermost fact about this comparison, that there is always a yogic element in the Sanskrit version and not in the Greek version. Now, what could this mean? Either the yogic aspect of the story was an innovation developed within the Indian branch. And indeed, that would fit one particular version of Indian history based on the Aryan invasion, namely those who say that yoga is something indigenous, that went underground for a while after the Aryan invasion, but that gradually came back up. And so at that point, it was inserted into Indo-European myths that had developed a Sanskrit version. But this is rather unlikely, because if they took in a new cultural content, namely yoga, from the indigenous people, they would probably have also taken over yogic stories equally borrowed from the indigenous people, rather than infusing their own existing stories with this new cultural content. Alternatively, the earlier version was like the Sanskrit version, namely proto-yogic in character, and it is the Greek version that has eliminated that aspect of the story. Allen argues for the second scenario. So he claims that definitely yoga is Indo-European in origin, was preserved in the Sanskritic tradition, and was lost in the Greek tradition. Now, this can happen anywhere, that people lose the subtle content of their story, holding only the bare bones of the story. And that, on the other hand, other people preserve that precious content of the story. It could happen anywhere. Nevertheless, it is realistic, it is not at all far-fetched to assume that the most subtle element was preserved in a favorable, stable setting of people who stayed where they were, and that the subtle content was lost in the rough and tumble of a long, difficult migration. So that it is the Greeks who remembered the story vaguely in broad outline, but had lost the most subtle elements. That, at least, is my proposal. So that also indicates rather the Indian homeland than a more westerly homeland. Then there is the literary evidence, and this is really special. This is the discovery by Shrikant Alageri, an Indian bank clerk, as the Aryan invasionists always dismissively call him. So an amateur historian. Initially, when he read the Rig Veda, he didn't even know Sanskrit. Meanwhile, he has learned a bit, but his main discoveries were already there when he was only consulting an English translation. So it's all there, even if you don't know Sanskrit. You may yet find very, very useful information concerning this homeland debate. Now, he says that in the Rig Veda, partly even in the Avesta, the Iranian scriptures, you find information pertaining to the disintegration of Indo-European unity. Now, nobody expected to find such a thing. The disintegration has been dated by linguists in combination with archaeological evidence about the wheeled vehicles and so on, to about 3,700, at most 4,000 BC. The earliest writings are from about 1500 BC, or that's what they thought. It is at any rate true for Hittite and Mycenaean Greek. It was also thought to be true for Sanskrit,